Thank you very much, Dino. Thank you so much for that introduction. A bit exaggerated, or perhaps a lot of exaggerations there, but I appreciate it. And thank you very much for everything that you're doing. And thanks for this fantastic opportunity. It is an honor and a great pleasure for me to take part in this event and to introduce such an accomplished scholar as Sir Noel Malcolm. I'm also very, very delighted that Sir Malcolm's lecture will be followed by a discussion from my dear friend, colleague, and mentor, Professor Nicholas Parnell, whom I consider as the Dean of the Albanian Studies in the US. Dino has shared Sir Noel Malcolm's biography, so I will just make some brief comments if I may. Sir Noel Malcolm's scholarly works have been an inspiration to me personally, and I believe to Albanians everywhere. His books are objective, they're well documented, and they're based on painstaking research of primary sources, which have not been widely consulted by other scholars. His recent book, as well as his previous ones, and especially the ones on Bosnia and on Kosovo, fill such an important vacuum and shed light on many issues not widely treated by other historians and political scientists. Sir Malcolm is in my book, he's a trailblazer in terms of the selection of the subjects for inquiry, and also the balance and objectivity that he displays in treating these very important and sensitive subjects. I particularly enjoyed reading his essay on the myths of Albanian national identity. In some respects, those myths survive to this day, even here in the Albanian American community. Then there are many other myths, and perhaps more dangerous myths, which are a contributing factor, in my opinion, to the politicization and the ideological friction that we from time to time witness in Albania, in Kosovo, as well as in the Albanian diaspora. But myths are not particular to the Albanians or more prevalent among them than among our neighbors in the Balkans. It is incumbent upon scholars to objectively address these issues, and Sir Noel Malcolm's contribution in this field cannot be overestimated. Albanians have yet to come to grips with their torturous past, to overcome the traumas left behind by Enver Hoxha's communist regime in Albania and Yugoslavia and Serbia's long occupation of Kosovo and other Albanian inhabited lands. But I think it is very encouraging, at least it's encouraging to me, that in the last 2 decades, scholars in Albania, in Kosovo, scholars in the Albanian diaspora, especially in the US, which don't really get that much credit, I'm afraid, and scholars of Albanian descent in Europe have produced solid historical studies. And this, in my opinion, will help Albanians deal more dispassionately with our past. Sir Malcolm's most recent book represents a very important contribution to the study of the Albanian history and can serve as a very good example for other students of Albanian history, whether they're Albanian or foreign scholars. And now I have the distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you Sir Noel Malcolm. Thank you.
Well, I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much. I very sincerely thank all of you who've spoken so far, Dino and the Albanian Institute for organizing this event, Richard, Eles, and General Clark. It would be a privilege to appear on any platform with you, but this is a special occasion. I'm very honored by your participation. I hope I've understood correctly that my task today, for which I'm allowed 30 to 40 minutes, is to talk about my new book. Rebels, Believers, Survivors, Studies in the History of the Albanians. I say new book, it came out last year, but it's only months old and may not have circulated very much so far on either side of the Atlantic. There may be something a little self-indulgent about an author talking about his book, but that's the situation I find myself in. And so I will be a little more self-indulgent and just lead into it by giving you a little bit of a background in my own life. Because this book is a collection of studies, and some have been published before. Most of the book is new, but the ones that have been published before, in a few cases, go back a good 20 years. So there's an element of autobiography for me when I look at these. So let me start at the beginning. Sometimes people have asked me why I got interested in the Albanian lands and did I have an Albanian grandmother, to which I'm sorry to say the answer is no. I got interested when I was a student at Cambridge University, and I discovered two things. One was the pleasure of mountain walking in Southeast Europe, where there are a lot of mountains and beautiful and fascinating cultures to get to know. And the other was that I discovered the language labs at the university, where you could go at any time of day, pick a course off the shelf, which had a course book and cassettes, take it to the machine, put in the headphones, and learn a language. So I got into the habit of spending an academic year in my free time learning a new language of a Balkan country, and then spending as much time as I could in the summer traveling, and particularly walking in the mountains. And that's one reason why I had to know the language. If you turn up at a village in the evening in the mountains, as you all know, people in that part of Europe are very hospitable. They will take you in, they will give you dinner and a bed for the night, but you have to give something in return. And the one thing you can do is satisfy their curiosity, answer their questions. I admit some of the questions threw me at the beginning. The first time I was asked, how much does a sheep cost in your country? I had to take a rather wild guess. But anyway, that was my principle. And so one year I learned modern Greek, the next year actually Turkish, then I think it was Romanian, then Serbo-Croat. And I had a go at Hungarian, but that is a really difficult one. And I went back to some of these countries and I was interested in the history and culture, and I went to the library. I could read things in their language. That extended my interest much further. But something began to bug me. There was one population, one very interesting part of the Balkans, what looked like a very interesting language, which I couldn't learn because there was no course for it, and that was Albanian. And this was the gap in the map, as far as I was concerned, in really getting to know the Balkans. It wasn't easy. And it was years before I found even an old course book that I could learn from, because there was nothing in print at that time. But in the early to mid 1980s, I started just teaching myself from a book, not even knowing how to pronounce it, and gradually filled in, got a reasonable knowledge of at least for reading purposes, and began to feel I was getting to grips with Albanian history too. Now, in the late 80s, I left academia for a while. I became a journalist, writing commentary and analysis for The Spectator, where I was foreign editor, and for The Telegraph, where I wrote about British politics. And this coincided then with the period of the breakup of Yugoslavia. I got very involved in public debates on that, not least because I think I was the only commentator in the British media who could actually read the language and had contacts and had been to Bosnia and had some sense of what was actually going on there. And as I got involved in debates, I realized that a lot of pretty terrible false history was circulating, some of it coming ultimately from the ministry in Belgrade. And it was circulating in the Western media and also in the brains of Western politicians, including some that were really determining Western policy towards Bosnia. Now, you couldn't really blame them. They just picked these things up from the media, the statement that Bosnia was a completely artificial entity invented by Tito, who just drew some lines on the map, which is ludicrous, or the argument that all the Bosnian Muslims were really Serbs. These things were part of the political propaganda. And this was a conflict where a lot of the political claims were essentially historical claims, and the great majority of them were bad history and absolutely false history. So although I was working full time, I thought, well, you can't blame these other journalists for getting all this wrong, because there is no book they can just turn to that will get things right for them. And I thought at first I would just write a little book called Myths and Realities of Bosnian History. Then I gradually realized it would be better to write a continuous history of Bosnia, but a short one. And so in 1994, I published a book called A Short History of Bosnia. And of course, there was a storm of hostile reaction from Serbs, not only in Serbia, but also in the diaspora, which got me more involved. And I have to say that it was at that moment that the idea came to me, this is not the only conflict that really rests on false history. I mean, it doesn't rest only on false history, but false history is so important in false political arguments. What about Kosovo? So the day I stopped writing the Bosnia book and sent it into the publisher, that afternoon I went back to the library and started working on a history of Kosovo. I had more time because there wasn't a war happening in Kosovo at that moment. And so I was able to do more thorough research, including going to archives in many European countries, doing what I hope is some useful original research. And the book that eventually came out in 1998 was longer, but I was very satisfied with it. I felt that I'd acted just in time before the war broke out in Kosovo, and I thought, well, at least ignorant journalists and ignorant politicians will have a chance to look at something and filter out some of the completely false claims before they start directing policy in an actual intervention in a war. So that got me really involved in Kosovar history, and indeed in various indirect ways in Albanian history, and I've never lost that interest. There were various things that kept me occupied, writing other studies, some of which are gathered in this new book. I took part in the legal team that was directed by a British lawyer, which presented Kosovo's case to the International Court of Justice in the case when the court was asked to give an opinion on the legality of the Declaration of Independence by Kosovo. My role was to go through the first wave of submissions, particularly the ones from Serbia, to which each country was allowed to respond, and to pick out historical falsehoods in what they had written. And to be honest, I was astonished by just how much falsehood there was there, including what you could only call deliberate falsifications of facts, mainly 20th century history, and coming right up to the time of the submission. So that also kept me involved. But I had other historical interests, and if we could just go back to the slide that has those books, I got particularly interested in a topic that led me to write a rather large book called Agents of Empire. I had been hunting for a manuscript which I'd found references to in a 16th century Italian text, references to a manuscript about the Albanians by an Albanian. And when I first read that about 25 years ago, a shiver went down my spine, because I thought, this is a manuscript which nobody knows, but if I could find it, it would be the first text written about Albanians by a known named Albanian. And after a long time, I actually found a manuscript copy in the Vatican. I rushed off and read it, transcribed it. It wasn't as long as I'd hoped, but it gave the name. It said the man was from Dulcinho, which is Ulcin. It was a common name. I had to do a lot of digging and hunting to track him down. But eventually, I found a lot of interesting material, not only about this Albanian from Ulcin, but also about his father, his uncle, several of his cousins, his nephew. And I realized that I had a whole extraordinary story of an Albanian family in late Renaissance Europe, in a territory that had belonged to the Venice for a long time and was then conquered by the Ottomans, but an Albanian family that crisscrossed the Mediterranean in the service of the Pope, the King of Spain, the Emperor, was involved in military action. The Great Battle of Lepanto, was involved in espionage, in trade and diplomacy. And I just thought this opens up a whole world of early modern Albanians and shows what a crossroads culturally, politically, diplomatically, this part of Europe was, and how Albanians could play a part that ramified all the way from Madrid to Moldavia. So that was the book I wrote, Agents of Empire, 2015. And that sort of stimulated more interest, of course, in other things that I wanted to work on. And now we come to the book that I'm meant to be talking about, which is the last one there, Rebels, Believers, Survivors. I don't know if you have, there might be a separate slide of that which shows the whole cover, because I chose a very nice illustration which the designers, I think, worked on very well. And that is a painting by, I'll just mention this now because I think it's a wonderful, painting by Guri Mardi, who was a rather brilliant artist from Korça, born around 1920. After the Second World War, he was able to study in Leningrad. And he was a really talented painter, as you can see from this painting on the cover of the book, which is just called The Highlander, Malissori. He had a fairly successful career in communist Albania, but at the end of his life, it's rather sad. He had to go to Budapest for an operation. His wife was forbidden to travel with him. That was the way the communist regime dealt with families. And he died a solitary death in a hospital in Budapest in 1988. But anyway, I'm very happy to have that on the cover of the book. So as I said, this book is a collection of studies, and some of them go back quite a long way. Most of the book consists of new material. The ones that have been published before have appeared in various different venues, and some of them would be very, very difficult or in fact impossible to find even in a major reference library. So I thought it was fully justified to gather them and publish them again. And they cover quite a range of topics that have taken my interest, from material in the 15th century to the early 20th. But I've steered clear of the very recent history of Yugoslav and post-Yugoslav politics and conflict, because I had written a lot about that in the Kosovo book particularly. I'll just talk very quickly about some of the topics that were previously published, and then I'll say more about the material that is entirely new in this book. Some of those earlier studies were a kind of spillover from the work I did on the history of Kosovo when I was writing that book. I got very interested in the so-called crypto-Christians of Kosovo, Lagaman being the traditional term, people who on the surface appeared to be Muslims, but secretly kept up Christian practices and Christian belief. In this case, unusually Catholic, because of course it was the Catholic Church that was active in Kosovo. This is a phenomenon, crypto-Christianity, that you find scattered in little areas here and there elsewhere in the Ottoman lands. There was a small community of Orthodox crypto-Christians in central Albania. They disappeared quite a long time ago, but the Laramans of Kosovo were still identifiable well into present lifetimes. Anyway, I used materials in the Propaganda Fide archives in the Vatican City, and a range of other materials there. And I hope I've sort of added a little to what is understood about this whole phenomenon and how it continued and why it happened in the first place. Another study connected with Kosovo was on Petar Bogdani, the great churchman, archbishop, who collaborated with the Austrian army when it invaded Kosovo in 1689 and died sadly of the bubonic plague which that army had possibly brought with it. But he's a fascinating figure, as you will all know, because he wrote the first really substantial original text in Albanian that was printed in Italy in 1684. And I wrote about him trying to dig a little deeper into the history of that book and why it takes the form that it does. And I gave that actually originally as an inaugural lecture when I was made a foreign member of the Kosovan Academy of Sciences and Arts. And it's dedicated to Ibrahim Rugova, who had a special interest in Pietro Bogdani and whom I had got to know reasonably well in the years before the war in Kosovo. Then there's an essay on the so-called Velika Seoba, or Great Exodus of the Serbs, of the following year, 1690, which is part of the mythical history of Kosovo that you find still, unfortunately, in Serbian textbooks. The idea that there was a mass exodus of the Serb population. This created a so-called ethnic vacuum, and this was then filled by hordes of Albanians who came in from the Mao Sea or further afield in Albania, and that is the explanation of the fact that there are Albanians living in Kosovo. It is entirely mythical. A certain number of people did flee from Kosovo in 1690. Quite a lot of Albanians fled. A number of Serbs fled, but we have fairly good evidence to give us the figures, and it's a small percentage of the Serb population, and some of them seem to have come back later. But I was interested in the ideological history of how this myth had developed and who had propagated it and how it had been adapted for modern political purposes. I say modern from the 19th century to the present day. And then finally, there's a little study of the League of Prizren, which was a lecture for a conference celebrating an anniversary in Pristina, and that has been published before, but only in a little book published in Albanian in Pristina. And then there were some other essays that were more on the Albanian side of the border. One on the Kelmendi, that very famous feast, the most powerful and perhaps historically the most interesting feast of the Great Mao Sea, the Northern Mountains. And I offered there a new explanation, I think, of the power that they got, which went back to a special legal status that they were granted by the Ottomans at a very early stage. Then I published the actual text of the manuscript by Antonio Bruni, the man from Ulcin that I had been obsessed with, it led me to write Agents of Empire. There wasn't room in the actual book to include that, so I published it later separately in a Balkan history journal. I put that into this book in a full English translation. And then a study which Elias Bibera mentioned, one on myths of Albanian nationalism, which I actually wrote while I was a visiting professor at Harvard, around about the time of the war in Kosovo. The library at Harvard is just a scholar's dream because it's like a palace of books. It goes on endlessly, and you can walk through it and take books off the shelf. It's open access for the users. And I found bound volumes of magazines produced by Fan Noli and Konstantin Cekrezi and others, these original Albanian American intellectuals clustered around Boston at the beginning of the 20th century. And I was struck by a sort of emerging pattern of rather mythical thought, which in many cases was understandable, in some cases was not completely false, but it was driven much more by a kind of mythical imagination and by political concerns. So I've done a little historical critique there, which I feel unfortunately still has some relevance because one sees some of these themes still appearing today. And I occasionally get strange emails from people I've never met telling me, but don't you know that all the names of the gods in classical Greek mythology are actually directly borrowed from Albanian words? This idea starts with that generation of Albanian Americans and well, a few predecessors, and I'm afraid it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So I hope that will be one of interest and perhaps a little challenging. And finally, there's a long study of Ernesto Cozzi, who was a marvelous man, a great albanologist who wrote fascinating work on the ordinary life of people in the Mare Sea. He was an Italian priest, a missionary priest, who spent most of his adult life in Albania, spoke Albanian fluently. He became a sort of activist. I found his diary from the First Balkan War in a remote Jesuit archive in northern Italy, and was able to reconstruct a lot of his life and actions from that and other documents. So I hope that is of interest too. And that was first published in a book edited by Albert Ramay from your counterpart, the Albanian Institute in Zurich. And it's a marvelous book, but being just a small institute in Switzerland and a charity, they didn't really have the ability to distribute widely to bookstores and libraries. So it would not be easy to find, I think, elsewhere. But now let me just talk about the things that are completely new in this book. There's an essay on pilgrim narratives from the 15th century. I gradually realized when I got into this material that there were a lot of descriptions of Albania written by pilgrims as they went down the coast from Venice on their way to Jerusalem. They were on Venetian galleys, and occasionally they would actually stop at Durrës, which was still a Venetian port, and there are descriptions there. Even if they don't come to land, they describe Albania according to what they've been told about it. They notice historical events. And these sources had not been used by historians at all. This is rather precious material from exactly the century of Skanderbeg. So I built an essay around that. Then there's a long essay on the Inquisition in early modern Europe and the Albanians who came into the hands of the Inquisition. And this, I hope, is interesting because it's entirely new material. None of this material has been published before. And the wonderful thing about the Inquisition in Italy and in Spain, and indeed in Portugal, is it had very high standards of record keeping. They actually wrote down what people said, and they wrote it down at length. So you get the voices of ordinary Albanians who, for one reason or another, have ended up in the hands of the Inquisition in Venice, or in Naples, or in Malta, or in Palermo, and they're telling you their life stories. And you even get the voices of women, and this is gold dust for a historian. It's very difficult to find first-person self-description, well, by any Albanian from the 16th and 17th century, but to get the voices of women in their own words, to me was very precious. And so some of these life stories, I mean, some are long, some are quite brief, they help to build up a picture of, among other things, how people were converted to Islam from Catholicism or Orthodoxy, or indeed how they were enslaved, sometimes in the most brutal and arbitrary and sort of opportunistic ways, even inside the Ottoman Empire, by slave dealers who would just grab young men or young women and take them off and sell them at the nearest slave market. So that, to me, is one of the most interesting chapters in the book. There's a fairly short chapter, but I think it's, well, I hope it's of real interest. The first Albanian autobiography. Completely unknown, a manuscript in a rather obscure ecclesiastical archive in northern Italy. It's a young man writing about his life. He's only 20 or 21 when he writes it. It's a funny age to write an autobiography, but he does. He's writing in Italian, very good Italian, but he's describing his life in Škoda. He was born in 1861, and he's describing life over the next 20 years after 1861. His father is a tailor in the market. He went to the Catholic school, was taught by Jesuits, wanted to become a priest. He writes rather beautifully. It's a little mysterious in places. He loves describing ordinary life. Because his father's a tailor, he's very good at describing household goods and particularly the clothes that people wear. But it's a fascinating text. I just don't have time to go back, copy out the whole thing and publish it as a book in the original Italian, but I hope that a scholar will before long. Anyway, I've put it before the public. And finally, there's a long essay on Ali Pasha of Tepelen. This is so long, it maybe sits like a cuckoo in the nest, It could almost be a separate book of about 160 pages. But I couldn't make it shorter because I just had wonderful material. I went to the archives to study his diplomatic dealings with Britain and with France, and I found so much material that historians have not used. This is set in the Napoleonic Wars, and Ali Pasha became, in the geopolitics of those wars, a really significant figure, and this has not been fully appreciated. Nobody knew whether Napoleon was going to invade the Ottoman Empire and take an army to Istanbul. And when I say nobody knew that, I'm including Napoleon, because he never had a fixed policy, but he liked to keep it as a possibility. And as time went on, he got control of quite a large area of what is now Croatia and Slovenia. And he'd also, because they were originally Venetian possessions and he'd conquered Venice, he got the Venetian possessions of the Ionian Islands, Corfu and the other islands down the coast, and Butrint, which belonged to Venice, and Parga, Preveza, and another little place in the Gulf of Arta. So he was a threat. He was already in the region. And Ali Pasha controlled this large part of the Western European Ottoman Empire, half of Albania, about a third to a quarter of Macedonia, and directly or indirectly, almost the whole of Greece. Everything would depend on him. If Napoleon decided to march through, if Ali Pasha resisted him, it would be difficult. I'm not saying Napoleon wouldn't have got through, but on those roads and with guerrilla warfare, it would have been a serious problem for the French. And Napoleon knew that, which is why he went to a lot of trouble to court Ali Pasha. But equally, the British knew. And so they were courting him too. And they sent famously William Martin Leake to be a sort of British ambassador permanently at the court of Ali Pasha. But there were other envoys too, and a lot of diplomatic correspondence. And I just thought this is marvelous material. And it also sheds a lot of light on Ali Pasha's relations with the Sultan in Istanbul, as he played an ingenious double game or treble game, trying to keep all these three parties, the British, the French, and the Sultan, somehow just about happy enough that they didn't take drastic action against him. And a kind of alliance developed fairly quickly with the British. So that was useful for the British, and it was actually very useful for Ali Pasha. But still, he had to play games, because until Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Moscow, nobody knew whether Napoleon was going to conquer the whole of Europe or not. And I take my hat off to Ali Pasha as a tactician and a strategist, and I hope that some of that comes through in what I've written about him. Now, I've talked for nearly half an hour, and the clock is ticking, but just some concluding remarks much more generally on some larger themes. When I think about the history of the Albanian lands and its sort of situation, I try to keep up with all the significant things that are published, and it's more difficult to keep up with the things published in Albania. But looking at what's written about Albania and Kosovo in the West, I mean, of actual history, and not just those day before yesterday political studies, which are, of course, valid, but that's not what I'm concerned with here. I'm still struck by what a Cinderella Albanian history is in the larger scheme of things. But there are some obvious reasons for that. I mean, the language is obviously the most important. There just aren't very many historians outside Albania who have learned the language, and that is a big problem. Partly because you want to reach original sources, and also because there are really serious modern works of history in Albanian which you need to study. But secondly, just the whole situation of history writing, if you look back 100, 150 years, compared with other Balkan countries, Albanians got off to a very late start for obvious reasons. You know, Greece and Serbia had fully fledged universities developed in the 19th century. Albania at that time had an Ottoman government which didn't want even primary school children to be taught in the Albanian language. So it really was a late start. And by the time they got going, general historians of the Balkans in Britain, France, Germany, and America would have a whole body of what they thought was reliable Balkan history produced by scholars from Greece and Serbia and Bulgaria, and they would be inclined to base their work to a significant extent on that. And then, of course, in the communist period, Albania was extremely isolated, and the professors of Yugoslav history, there were some very good ones in America, but they would send their doctoral students to Belgrade, typically. Quite a few of them were from a Serb diaspora. And people would go to Belgrade, and even if they were quite independent-minded, it was natural they would pick up a rather Belgrade-centered view of the history of Yugoslavia, including Kosovo. So that was one disadvantage. But the deeper disadvantages, I think, are so obvious that perhaps I hardly need to say them. One is called communism, and the other is called nationalism. And Albanian history, unfortunately, has had quite large doses of both of those. There's nothing special about this, obviously, because all the other communist countries had the communist version, and in different shapes and forms, they all got an element of nationalism, which existed as an essential part of history study and history writing before the communist period, because all the countries that we think of as ex-communist countries in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe had formed from some sort of political struggle to acquire independence. And for that purpose, history was utilized and in some cases very much instrumentalized. So this is a natural thing that nationalist history is sort of built into the system. But when communism comes in and then sort of manipulates it and creates a strange hybrid of the two, the result is really quite negative for serious historical work. And that's one reason why some of the best work done in that whole communist period was done by members of the Albanian diaspora. And it's a great pleasure and a great honor that Professor Panos has joined us today, because I'm thinking not least of him. But communism, well, it's not difficult to see why communism leads to bad history. But communism has a tendency, obviously, to eliminate the things it disapproves of. And so religious history, for example, is, in the case of communist Albanian history writing, almost completely eliminated. And this is fatal for a country where, in the northern half of the country, the Catholic clergy had played such an essential part in the whole cultural and linguistic development, the literature that they had generated, people like Fichte, who were simply removed from the libraries under communism. But nationalism also has a sort of eliminatory tendency, not as bad as that, but those who are regarded as not having fought the national struggle, those who became Ottoman landowners are regarded as some sort of traitors to the national cause. In extreme versions, those who converted to Islam are regarded as having failed to follow the correct sort of national program. And this can have a very distorting event. And the problem with all kinds of history written from these ideological viewpoints is they give you black and white history, good guys and bad guys. That's bad enough in itself, but it's more deeply unhistorical, because the assumption is, well, the good guys, by definition, were just like us, and the bad guys were whatever they were, but the bad guys were the sort of the wrong thing, which was different. And nothing could be more unhistorical than assuming that everyone you look at, going back centuries, if they're to be of serious interest and worth, writing about and studying, they have to be in some essential way like us. For me, the fascination of history is that people in the past are not just like us. And sometimes we find things that are amazingly similar, and sometimes we find things that make us feel we're looking at a different planet. And that's part of the human experience, I think, of getting to know other people, other cultures. It's been part of a very, very positive part of my experience to get to know Albanian culture and history. But in the end, you have to take it on its own terms. And as a historian, You have to look at the evidence and just try to see what it tells you. And I've done my best. Everyone has their blind spot and their ignorance, but I hope essentially that's what I've done in this book. Thank you very much.